Come to Jesus. Now your burden's lifted. Carry all away. Precious blood has washed away the stain. You're listening to a message presented at New Market Christian Church. We're located at 300 South 3rd Street in New Market, Indiana. We meet for Sunday school at 9 o'clock and for worship at 10 o'clock each Sunday morning. If you do not have a church home, we'd love to invite you to join us here at New Market Christian Church. And now, a message by Dr. Gary Snowden. The text we're going to be examining this morning is Mark chapter 8, verses 11 to 26. Now, I've titled this morning's message, Failure or Fabulous. Right now, that won't make a whole lot of sense, but as we go throughout the morning, I think that title will begin to click with each and every one of us. Failure or fabulous. Now, Mark records a lot of Jesus' miracles, but this miracle is unique to his gospel. That means you don't find it in the other gospels. It's just right here in Mark, laid out for us to see, and he puts it in the context that so often is missed. You see, Jesus heals a blind man, but something seems to have gone amiss. Something seems to have gone wrong. He didn't heal him all the way. He was still fuzzy-sighted. The man is only partially healed. And when Jesus asked him how his eyesight was, he told him, Snowden's paraphrase, well, that's not so good. I mean, I can see people walking around, but they look like trees. That's kind of not good. That's a real challenge, guys. This seems just a little weird. As I read that over the years, it popped out to me again and again, and I just kept thinking, how strange is it that this happened? You've got to ask yourself, what's going on here? Why can't the creator of the universe, the one who spoke the stars into existence, why can't he get it right the first time? Have you ever wondered that? As you've read that passage, have you ever wondered that? Why couldn't he get it right the first time? Was Jesus a failure on his first try? I think we can answer that question as we proceed throughout the morning. I hope we can clear up this whole snafu as we study today's text. Let's get started this morning by reading Mark chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. Here's what it says there in Mark chapter 8, beginning with verse number 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. Can you imagine that? He sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. In the book of Mark, he's trying to answer one big question throughout the entire thing. And that question is simply this. Who is Jesus? That's what Mark seems to be trying to answer. If Jesus really is God come in the flesh, then that changes everything. If he is who he said he is, then that changes everything. In today's passage, the Pharisees are testing Jesus' authenticity. If you are who you say you are, give us a miracle from heaven. Show us the magic, so to speak. They want Jesus to put on a magic show to prove that he is who he claims to be. Now, there's just a bit of irony in their request. The fact is, Jesus' whole life on this earth was a sign. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Jesus' whole life was a sign from God. It's a sign of God's loving presence among us. From a merely human standpoint, the Pharisees' request seems to be somewhat innocent. I mean, show us a sign. But Jesus reacts very strongly to their request. He sighs. That sigh, it shows us that this question bothered him. It was an aggravation to him. The fact is, Jesus had been providing abundant signs day after day throughout his entire life, healing the blind, the lame, the sick, feeding multitudes with meager resources. The Pharisees don't see it, not because it wasn't provided. The Pharisees don't see it because they didn't want to see it, and Jesus knows it. Their blindness is a central theme in this part of the book of Mark. And you got to wrap your mind around that in order for everything to come together and make sense later. Jesus tells them point blank, they won't be getting any miracles today. Jesus has literally had his fill of these guys. He is full up to here with their insinuations and with their tricks and trappery. It's not that there hasn't been proof of who he is. It's that these religious folks are ignoring everything he's done. Both his words and his works are being ignored. Well, Jesus has had enough, so he's going to ignore them, and he's going to ignore their request. He just takes off, and get this, walks away and leaves those religious rulers who thought they were something special standing there. You see, Jesus knows the hearts of these men. He knows the motives of these men. And he knows that these Pharisees are two-faced. Soon he's going to reveal their true hearts to his disciples. Let's continue reading there in Mark chapter 8, verses 13 to 16. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? Is that why he's saying this? Is it because we have no bread? You see, these guys had left so quickly that they didn't think to pack a lunch for their trip. They just got into the boat and headed off in the direction that Jesus told them to go. And while the disciples were thinking about their lack of bread, Jesus was focused on the hearts of these hard-hearted Pharisees and the murderous King Herod. His words, well, they perplexed his disciples. Their lines of communication end up getting all crossed. Jesus is saying one thing, and they're hearing something else. They aren't communicating. They aren't making contact with each other's hearts and minds. The disciples thought they were being scolded for their lack of foresight, not bringing any bread. But Jesus was much more concerned about their complete lack of faith in who he was. Jesus' words, I believe, were meant to lead them into a discussion. His goal was to reveal what got him so out of fix with Herod and so out of fix with the Pharisees. He tells his disciples to watch out for the yeast of Pharisees, to watch out for the yeast of Herod. Both Pharisees and Herod were pretty influential people. They both have seen and heard Jesus. And as a result, they'd come to some conclusions that they laid out very clearly so that everyone knew where they stood. The Pharisees had gone on record saying that Jesus performed his miracles by the power of Satan. They said by the power of Beelzebub he works miracles. In essence, they identified Jesus as a demon-possessed man working for the devil himself. Herod had gone on record saying that Jesus was nothing more than the reincarnation of John the Baptist. He did this out of a sense of superstition and guilt over killing John the Baptist. You remember his stepdaughter had danced for him, and he liked it so much that he said, I'll give you anything you want, up to half my kingdom. And she went and talked to her mama, and her mama was mad at John the Baptist for saying she shouldn't have left her first husband to come live with him. And as a result, she said, go back and ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. She did, and Herod couldn't find any reasonable way out of it, so he had John beheaded. And now he thinks he's returned from the dead to exact his revenge. They failed to see who the Messiah really was. They failed to see that Jesus was God come in the flesh. Not getting this was a major miss for the Pharisees. Not getting who Jesus was a major miss for Herod. And Jesus is warning his disciples to watch out so that they would not miss who he truly was. But their minds are so focused on lunch that they miss Jesus' point completely. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Beware of the yeast of Herod. Don't miss who I am like Herod did. Don't miss who I am like the Pharisees did. Jesus' disciples just don't get it. What does this have to do with the bread dilemma? What does this have to do with lunch? Jesus is comparing not bringing bread to the evils of the Pharisees and Herod? How could that be? Could you just imagine their minds going around in circles? We just didn't bring bread. We're not like the Pharisees. We didn't bring bread. We're not like Herod. We didn't kill somebody. What's up with Jesus telling us to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, to beware of the leaven of Herod? You need to know some of the background about leaven. You put just a little bit of yeast in some dough, and it just keeps puffing up, and it gets bigger and bigger, and it swells all up, kind of like me after eating ice cream. No, well, you know, they use as an example often, historically, of bad things getting in and permeating everything, just spreading out. It's like somebody bad getting in government, and it just spreads out, or something bad happening inside of a church, and it just spreads out, or something bad happening in community, or it spreads, kind of like this coronavirus thing. Something bad gets started and just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's how they often use the yeast illustration. And that's kind of what the disciples are thinking, but they're connecting it to bread and missing the whole point. They just aren't making the connection. I'm guessing the disciples were scratching their heads and wondering what in the world Jesus was trying to get them to understand. Now for us, looking back, hindsight's 20/20. We can read the story and see all the ins and outs, but they were living in the moment. They had forgot to pack bread, and that's where their minds were. That's what they were thinking about. Here's the thing. Not packing bread, not bringing lunch, that really isn't a capital offense. I mean, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. They seem to be completely oblivious to the fact that they're in a boat with the Messiah. They're worried about bread, and they're riding with Jesus. Like the Pharisees and like Herod, they failed to comprehend who Jesus was. They failed to comprehend who was in the boat with them. The fact is, Jesus wasn't concerned about their lack of bread. He wanted them to know that the Pharisees and Herod have a condition that they need to be aware of so that they don't fall into it themselves. The Pharisees and Herod are spiritually blind. The fact that they missed the whole point of who Jesus was makes it pretty clear that Jesus was correct. These disciples aren't getting it either. They don't recognize that they're in the boat with the Messiah. They're in the boat with God, so to speak. He's trying to provide them with spiritual instruction, and they're so caught up in the physical realm that they can't see it. And as a result, this group of his close disciples completely miss his point. They're so focused on bread that Jesus' warning is going in one ear and out the other without registering in between. Their own words in verse 16 makes this clear. They say, it's because we didn't bring bread. That's why he's saying this. It's because we didn't bring bread. This complete lack of connection prompts some words that I'm guessing would have been really hurtful for this group of disciples. Let's read on there in Mark chapter 8, verses 16 to 18. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? Jesus, in his own unique way, rebukes this group of close disciples for their lack of spiritual perception. They had failed to learn from his words. They had failed to learn from his works. Jesus is telling them in a pungent way that they've got the same issue that he's been telling them the Pharisees have and that Herod has. But they just can't catch what Jesus is throwing out. They completely miss the fact that they're struggling to fully see who Jesus is and the power that Jesus wields. They've got completely misconstrued ideas of what their kingdom role is going to be. I mean, you're going to find these guys arguing back and forth over who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. They just don't get it. Jesus puts it this way. Do you have eyes but fail to see? Ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember the miracles that you've seen? In essence, you guys have the same issues that the Pharisees are struggling with. Spiritual blindness. They're so caught up in their own view of reality that they can't see the spiritual truths Jesus is pointing out directly to them. Their vision is clouded, if you will. Unfortunately, you and I are not immune to this issue today. The same issue that plagued the disciples, we can have trouble with too. We're often so earthly minded that we're slow to grasp what Jesus is trying to teach us. We forget that Jesus is right here with us in this room, that his Spirit fills us. We get worried about what we're going to eat. We get worried about what we're going to drink, what we're going to wear, where we're going to live, what we're going to drive. We worry about the bills. We worry about the kids. We worry about the job. We worry about our house. We seem to forget that the one who fed the multitudes is with us, that his Spirit lives in us. We laugh at the disciples because their vision was clouded. But the fact is, sometimes our vision is clouded too. Jesus is about to open their spiritual eyes. I hope as we study the interaction, we too can have our eyes open to just how awesome our Savior truly is. There's a good chance that we, like these disciples, need a second touch. Like the blind man needed a second touch. Let's continue our study by reading Mark chapter 8, verses 19 to 21. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketful pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? Don't you get it yet? Can't you see this? Jesus' point to us is abundantly clear. I fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 12 baskets full of leftovers showed up. I fed 4,000 people with 7 loaves and had 7 baskets full of leftovers show up. Don't you think I could take care of lunch? It seems so clear to us. But it was all muddied up. Their eyesight was fogged up. Jesus just seems to let them stew for a bit as they make their way on to Bethsaida. Let's keep reading there in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand. Now get this. Took him by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes, and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people, but they look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. A second touch, if you will. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. He needed a second touch to have his eyesight cleared up. These disciples need a second touch to have their eyesight cleared up. Sometimes we need a second touch to have our eyesight cleaned up. Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. Now I'm pretty sure that the one who spoke the world into existence could have healed this blind man on the first try if he wanted to. How many of you think that's true? How about outside? Can you beat your horn? You think that's true? Yeah, he could have done it, couldn't he? He created the universe. He could have healed it the first time if he wanted to. So you have to ask yourself, why was this a 2-stage healing? Was this a failure or was this fabulous? Was it a failure or was it a way for Jesus to illustrate his disciples' plight? Thus the title of today's message, failure or fabulous? Jesus' question, do you see anything, seems to anticipate his blurry vision. I personally think Jesus was providing his disciples with a fabulous object lesson. Jesus did the same thing for this man that he has done and is doing for his disciples. Their vision has been clouded, but he's clearing up their spiritual sight. We all, you see, to one extent or another, have the spiritual vision, now this ought to get you age-wise, of Mr. Magoo. Mr. Magoo. Yeah, the young people say, who? But the older people say, yeah, I get it. If you're old enough, you're going to remember Mr. Magoo. He was a short, wealthy retiree who gets a lot of real messes in his life because he's nearsighted and too stubborn to admit it. That's our problem, too. Not only is our vision cloudy, but we often are unwilling to admit that it is. We claim that we see when really we don't get it. We don't want to admit that we just don't get it. As we read the story of the blind man, I think we're supposed to say, that's a pretty good picture of me. I've started my journey with Jesus, but things are still a little cloudy. I need a second touch, Jesus. I need to have things clarified for me, Jesus. I need to understand more clearly, Jesus. My spiritual vision is a bit cloudy, but Jesus is working on me, and he's not finished with me yet. Spiritual blindness, I think, is a problem for all of us. Either you're spiritually blind now, or you had been in the past. Being a disciple is not a guarantee of perfect vision. You can go to church all your life and still be spiritually blind, just sitting in the pew and not really getting it, not really making the connection. It's not about attending, it's about a relationship with God. Just like these disciples, you hear Jesus' words and you see his works, but you can't imagine that he's actually there for you. In this passage, we see two types of spiritual blindness. The kind that the Pharisees had. When Jesus confronts them, you get the sense that there isn't much hope for them. They've chosen to reject him. Even when evidence was very clear and right in front of their noses, they rejected him. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for an excuse. They'd rather kill Jesus than accept Jesus. They've developed a case of self-inflicted spiritual blindness, if you will. Now, it's possible for us to decide not to see Jesus for who he is, just to reject it all. It's possible for us to be just like the Pharisees and say, I see, I read, I understand, but I'm not about to follow him. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to sow my wild oats. If you choose to willingly reject Jesus, there isn't much hope for you. But there's another type of spiritual blindness, a blindness that we see in his disciples. They're blind, but there's hope for them. They're so distracted by the temporal things, like the lack of lunch, that they just don't get it. Jesus has fed thousands of people with next to nothing. And these guys are worried about lunch? They're so trapped in their own little world that they can't see the kingdom of God breaking through into history. Now, we can't be too hard on them because we're pretty much in the same boat. We get distracted by our daily needs. We get so worried about the little things that we miss what God's doing all around us. But friends, there is hope. Jesus doesn't give up on his disciples. He asks them questions to help them see what they need to see. And that's why I love the fact that Jesus healed the blind man in 2 stages. If Jesus had left his vision all cloudy, he would have spent the rest of his life saying hello to trees and chopping down people. But he didn't. He didn't. He healed them. This should give us great hope. If we aren't there yet, even if our vision is still just a bit cloudy, we know God's still working on us, and he's not finished with us yet. Through the touch of the Master's loving hand, we will one day see clearly. Jesus can heal even the most difficult cases. He'll complete the good work that he's begun in us. The passage ends with a picture of a once blind man seeing clearly. It may be slow. It may come in stages. But he eventually sees clearly. This morning, there's hope for those of us with cloudy vision. Right now, spiritually speaking, things look about as cloudy as they did for this blind man partway through his healing. We see what's going on in the world around us. We don't understand it. Why is there rioting in the streets? Why are they burning Bibles? Why are they tearing down courthouses? Why? What's going on, Jesus? People may look like trees walking around. We may not understand it clearly, but the answer to our life challenges will not elude us forever. With God's help, if we look to him, he will give us that second touch. The fact is, Jesus already knows the answers to all the problems we see going on around us. Even if we've got the smallest spiritual hunger, here's the thing. Even if we've got the smallest spiritual hunger in our hearts and in our minds and in our souls, that's evidence that Jesus is still at work in our life. We're not like the Pharisees. We're like the disciples. We're looking for that second touch. If we will let him, he will give us that second touch and focus our spiritual eyesight. We must never settle to continue with cloudy vision. We must admit that we need to see better. We must come to Jesus. We must seek his intervention. We must submit to his will for our lives. We must trust him to heal our spiritual eyesight. Because you see, Jesus is our only hope. He won't leave anything incomplete. He can take us, blindness and all, and make us just as if we'd never sinned. If you have eyes that have been opened this morning by looking at God's word, understanding it more clearly, if your eyes have been opened, then it's time for you to come and say, Jesus, I'm a mess. I need you to clean me up. I want to come just as I am and let you help me be all I can be. Dear Lord, give me that second touch. If you're ready to turn your life over to Jesus, we'll be glad to talk with you. If you're in the parking lot, just flag me down. If you're in here, just come forward as we sing together, just as I am. You've been listening to a message presented by Dr. Gary Snowden, minister at Newmarket Christian Church. We would love to have you come join us as we seek to worship God, love one another, and reach out to our neighbors.